And welcome to this Centre for Fashion Curation event at the London College of Fashion. My name is Judith Clark. I'm co-director of the Centre for Fashion Curation with Amy de la Haye, and I'm delighted that we're hosting this event. So, as you know, tonight's event coincides with the exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum, Fashioning Masculinities, which is on display until November the 6th. So if you haven't seen it, of course, you'll have been inspired to do so after this evening, which resonates with research that is being conducted within our department here at the university, looking at the multiple and ever-multiplying ways in which masculinity might be recognised and experienced. By adding the word fashioning to the exhibition title, it's extended further, drawing attention to it as a construct around an idea that is open to interpretation. So the conversation this evening promises to be very much in keeping with the Centre's remit, and that is to maintain a live debate around exhibitions, to close read them, to acknowledge them as particular forms of practice-based research, and that their meaning will shift, making this one of many conversations around this particular exhibition. So it's my personal pleasure to invite Claire Wilcox, an essential member of our centre, to speak on behalf of both institutions, therefore, London College of Fashion and the V&A, where she is curator of dress and author of so many seminal exhibitions. Marta Franceschini, with whom I've had the great pleasure of working with in Italy, and whose expertise on especially Italian fashion, but also her broader interests, have benefited our master's programme here, and where she has come as a visiting lecturer. And the architect Jayden and director of JA Projects, who I'm delighted could join us this evening to underline how conversations around fashion exhibition making intersect with broader architectural debates and projects, temporary and permanent, and through the preoccupation with anthropocentric spaces and ideals. The Centre's role at the university is one of expanding the perimeters around our discipline, or perhaps removing them, or making them more porous. I'm going to end my introduction with a quote written of James Joyce's Ulysses by an Italian music composer, Berio. So he writes, "He knew that scholars would not be able to resist the temptation to identify references and allusions once they knew they were there. But he also knew that living with half-recognized and with deceptive identities was an important dimension of Ulysses, as it was any form of poetry. It's the pinning down per se, as if to prove the permanent legitimacy of a detail, that deprives the narrative of its dynamic and still unknown potentials." So let's listen to their conversation and leave some of the issues open. So I'm going to hand over to Claire Wilcox first of all. Just a note on the format of the session. It's going to be about an hour in total, more or less, give or take. 40 minutes of conversation, and then around 20 minutes of questions. So it'll end around 6:30. But both Claire and Marta have said that they're happy to stay a little bit longer to answer any specific, questions should you have any. So I'm going to hand over to Claire Wilcox, and welcome again.
Thank you very much. I expect this has been turned on by some miracle. Yeah. I've had nothing to do with the mic, so hopefully you can hear me. So we've got a slide presentation here, which is just going to be rolling on in the background, but I do have some power over it, so I can stop it if we want to focus on a particular image. What I really wanted to do with this session is to continue the sort of conversations the three of us had also with my co-curator, Rosalind McKeever, who can't be here tonight. An exhibition such as this is a complex beast. We began thinking about it a very long time ago, fully aware of two things. One, that the V&A had never staged a major exhibition on menswear. And secondly, that if we were to do this, it would have to be major in some slightly different ways. It would be impossible to do a chronological survey of the entire history of menswear in one exhibition. So we very much feel that this exhibition is about an opening up of debate around the subject. And I'm hoping this will sort of get itself going. Maybe I just do it myself. Okay. So one of the sort of very helpful aspects of... Oh, here we go. Oh dear, we have a bit missing. We've got...
I think he's just going to try and change the first bit.
Okay, right, we'll bear with this. So one of the very helpful things that we devised early on was this organisation into 3 sections: undressed, overdressed and redressed. And when we were faced with the entirety of the V&A's collection, and I include art in that, sculpture, paintings, photography, film, we realised that actually if it didn't fit into one of these sections, then it had to go. And painful though this was, and it did mean losing Romeo Gigli, which I don't think Marta's ever got over, we knew that these 3 anchors, this sort of tripartite structure, which was very stable, would help us through many difficulties, including working during the pandemic. We, at one point, had well over 1,000 outfits alone on our object list, and we just had to prune it down and whittle it down. But I think, Jayden, even when we met you, it was still ridiculous, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So the structure of these 3 parts really began with a big question, which I feel, speaking for myself, probably never really addressed, and we certainly hadn't thought about it in the museum, is that without the body there can be no fashion. So the first gallery is entirely devoted to the male body as realised through beautiful photography, classical sculpture, the sort of sculpture that would be stumbled across if you were a gentleman undertaking the grand tour. And the way that these ideals have been perpetuated continues right up to the present. So we have this notion of classical perfection, idealised perfection coming up again and again, but there's always the counter-argument, the diversity of body shapes. And this was very important to us to reflect all this. And I'm just going to hand over to you, Jayden, now, because that was something we talked about a lot, wasn't it? How do we reflect diversity through curation and exhibition design?
Yeah, and I think that as an aspect is a really big aspect of our practice as well. So maybe it's worth kind of maybe shedding a little bit of light into how we get into this project, which is Yvonne Mackenzie, who's the head of design at the V&A, sends me an email and says, oh, we'd love for you to pitch for this project. I think, well, obviously this isn't true, and who's spoof calling me? Ask her a set of questions. And then she had some really good reasons as to why she wanted us to pitch, and it was based upon, she'd seen some work that we'd done previously for the British Pavilion, which was unsuccessful a couple of years ago, and we made this film where he was kind of projected large in the space, and it was about being represented in that space, and so that was really comforting as a moment. So it also gives you an indication she gave us an indication as to kind of what our strengths were in that moment, but also us being honest to that as a continuous pursuit. And I love this idea of, I've never heard you quite articulate it like that. Without the body, there is no fashion, so succinctly. But when one is talking and thinking about the body, obviously one starts to think about themselves. And when one is thinking about an exhibition in the V&A, you're thinking about the institution. So we always ended up in this space, which is to say, if we're going to produce a pitch which was honest to us, we must start to grapple with the issues and the tensions that exist in those moments, which is why we've ended up in this space, kind of really proactively trying to work with yourselves on that agenda of how to kind of present other modes of beauty and other bodies in the space. And it's worth saying that the first pitch that we had for this presentation, just in terms of sequence, runs chronologically through those spaces, so it will be on loop. And just to kind of orientate yourself, obviously, undressed is the kind of pale, brown-toned first room. And when we first pitched for that, it was that tone, I would say, but it had these big sculptural hanging brown bodies in the space, and it was really a commentary in terms of saying what do we think is not represented in this museum space? I grew up in Bethnal Green. My local museum was the Museum of Childhood, and I lived in this museum during the winter. It was the only free place where my mum would take me to be in shelter from the rain. But there was always this nagging feeling that museum was never for me in terms of its collection. And so we really wanted to try and challenge some of that stuff in terms of South Kensington. And I suppose what's interesting about the body, I was thinking about this the other day, and interesting about some of the works maybe as well, is that they simultaneously present an idea of strength and fragility. And I remember you said this really nice thing before, which was that it's a really fragile moment when an exhibition designer comes into a project because you've been dealing with your baby for a long time. But also I think that was a really kind of bold and strong moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we interviewed you, which was all online, wasn't it?
Yeah.
We have laughed a bit about this, but I didn't actually really like your design. I liked you.
Claire told me that about 2 months ago, and we've been working together for about a year and a half.
I know. The thing is that we could talk, we could communicate, and I think that you understood that we had actually set ourselves a really difficult challenge in doing this. I mean, the first gallery alone was challenging, that here we were presenting whitewashed plaster casts, which are inherently fragile, depicting images of perfection and strength. Mm. So we had we had the relationship between these embodied physical virtues alongside clothing, which we also placed on plinths. Mm. And we were, in addition, trying to discuss the whole story of the cloth next to the skin, cotton, linen. And so we had all these challenges swirling around. And what you did was you came in, you understood, and you sort of moved the chess pieces around. You made it reasonable and logical, but the revelation was you introducing the fabric walls, because those softened the tones of this sort of starkness in a way, which, you know, in other ways was sort of an homage to the Viennese sculpture courts, which are so abstractly beautiful and so unreal. You know, so we have this tension between a worn-out 18th century linen shirt and then a sculpture and then the backdrop that you created.
And it's worth saying that backdrop has a very specific quality
it's coming
to
up.
it. It will circle around, but it has a very specific quality to it, and it's one of it's of lightness and illumination, and it's purposefully illuminated from the top, and that's because we always wanted it to feel. I remember having these discussions. We wanted it to feel chapel-like. Actually, it's not necessarily. It's not so much a kind of over critique or a one-dimensional critique of the museum institution. It's saying there are really kind of amazing aspects to South Ken, really beautiful aspects to South Ken, about the preservation of objects, about the preservation of stories, of narratives. But actually, what's missing, if you like, and I suppose that's our point with every project we do. We're trying to be in dialogue with other aspects of it and contribute to the conversation. And so we ended up in this space where saying, well, how do we not detract from the objects? The objects have to hold space, and we have to give them the reverence that they need. But and I suppose we were getting that a little bit wrong when we had these big hanging objects in the middle of the room. It was a really simple move, just to move those depictions of kind of other bodies and celebrated other body types to the periphery. But actually, for them not to be peripheral, they are really kind of bold and present and heroic in that space. And we actually worked with a South African. It took us ages to find the correct photos to use in those moments. There's so many different technical challenges, how they were coordinated with the cabinets that were built into the walls, how you would kind of coordinate them with 2D works. But one challenge was finding high-res enough photos to to compose these giant contemporary frescoes in this space, and also how we would find the right photos and a photographer that would be willing for us to play with their photos to create new montages and abstractions from them. So I think that was really about, we made sure that there was an additional budget to pay people for their work as well. So there's always this underlying sentiment of care that permeates, I think, across the entire gallery. Even today, we were just having a conversation. We're trying to find an afterlife for these curtains. You'll see that they appear in section 3 as well, in Redressed. And we were previously talking to Bethany Williams about using them in some of the work, and we're still trying to. That might not turn out well in the end, but we're still trying to find that kind of romantic ending to the story.
It's interesting thinking about the age of clothes, the way that notions of the ideal appearance, the masculine appearance, the depictions of masculinity through photography and painting that we fill the galleries with, offering all these different alternatives. And then thinking, there's no images, I don't know what's happening, but you'll have to imagine the exhibition. And then thinking about the sort of fragility of cloth. And I apologise if someone was in my earlier talk today, but I visited Savile Row yesterday, and what they were talking about was how the practice of hand-woven cloth, hand-constructed clothing, bespoke clothing, is inherently sustainable because everything is always mended and re-offered to the next generation. So can you talk a little bit about sustainability in your practice?
Yeah, and I can also speak a little bit about sustainability in exhibition design, which is a really tricky thing to achieve, because there is a culture of exhibition making which is very fast-paced and very high turnaround. And it's not for lack of the desire to do projects that are completely zero carbon or have or completely deploy circular economy principles. It's just that when you get into the practicality of delivering these projects, what do you end up with is that there's a very short window for delivery, for turnaround, maybe 6 weeks between exhibitions, which means there's no wriggle room, and that's always been pre-decided. It was pre-decided by the museum. There's a similar scenario we're encountering with the V&A East, where the practice is designing the V&A East galleries for the new site in Stratford. And there's a lot of ambition about being sustainable. But actually, I think there's a real need for research and development in that space, and there's a real need for someone to say, okay, well, in your conventional sense, in the projects that you do now, you have 8 weeks to do kind of conceptualization. But actually, you probably need 16, because we're going to do the conceptualization, then we're going to really kind of conceptualize how we can deliver this and make this really incredibly sustainable. So it's something that we're doing in an iterative way. We took some steps towards that in this exhibition. We met with, I think the V&A has a sustainability advisor, someone that does sustainability in-house, who's kind of pushing the agenda. But where we ended up was a bit of a combination, which is why we're still working really hard to find modes of reuse for post-exhibition, which is that we were reusing a lot of work from previous exhibitions. So for the most part, apart from the bespoke billiards table in the middle of section 2 in the middle of Overdressed, all of the glazing is reused from Iran. We designed it in such a way that you just take big chunks of glaze in, you have floating walls in front, you can slide them, they just have to be oversized to use that. There are other aspects in which we really want to use walls, but it's really difficult to reuse these walls. They're these ginormous walls, and we say, okay, well, why don't we use them? But they're 5 meters high and 12 meters long. And they say, well, it's a health and safety hazard because we can't move these things. So we ended up selecting certain walls just to retain. So if you went to Alice in Wonderland, I'm not sure anyone went to Alice in Wonderland before Fashion and Masculinities, but the arrangement is similar. The spine of the exhibition is similar. And maybe that's just about being brave enough to say, it doesn't need to be completely new. I don't think you feel like you're in an Alice in Wonderland exhibition. I feel like you feel you're in Fashion and Masculinities. But it's about just knowing where you can keep things and retain things and where you have a strategy for reuse. There are other aspects that exist in some of the 2D work as well. You know, all of the printing is kind of with is non-canonical based printing. All of the labels are printed on some form of textile as well. So it's not where we would love it to be, but we're kind of edging closer. I think it's better than previous exhibitions, which is nudging the dial somewhat.
So moving on to the second gallery, this gallery is called Overdressed, and it's about all the sumptuousness of menswear, predominantly in the 18th century, very much reflecting the Viennese collection, which is based on acquisitions made because the textile was important rather than the fashion. So we have got dozens of 18th century court waistcoats. They're all equally beautiful. It's really hard to choose. They're just jewel-like garments, but it's a very unrealistic reflection of 18th century menswear. Of course, we acknowledge that this particular aspect of the collection does lean towards the decorative, the privileged, the elite, and we thought rather than deny that, we would celebrate that in the second gallery, and we would also include the work of designers like Harris Reed, like Grace Wells Bonner, who are embracing colour, who are embracing new fabrics. I mean, for example, Grace Wells Bonner is using mohair, traditionally used for women's wear. So this gallery required a more sumptuous treatment, didn't it? And we talked a lot about, I suppose, the richness of colour, the fact that the vitrines are encasing these treasures. In a way, it was a bit sort of tongue-in-cheek. Again, it was a bit of a sort of homage to other V&A galleries, permanent galleries like Europe, the British galleries.
There's the question when you encounter all of these rich and sumptuous works is how rich and sumptuous do you make the space, and do you pare it back and do you just give it the space to breathe, or do you give it all of the embellishment to kind of match it and be in dialogue? And I think we're somewhere in the middle. We have really bold colours and really amazing textures. When you walk into Overdress, you're presented by a woven cotton wool lining. But it has a depth to it. You have to be in that space to kind of to feel it. But there are nods to a grand country house in this space. The Dado Rail exists at country house level, but it's a really kind of contemporary iteration. We strip things down. We don't have ornament, but some of the walls are slightly curved, and we've done a lot of looking at neoclassical buildings in Europe for their forms and Rococo-inspired spaces to define the palette of the space. And I just wanted to go back, before I just jump into this, yeah. I think it's good to just speak about the transition space, because there's a central axis that maybe we can come back to, which is this wall in the middle. And you have to excuse the crop because there's a little bit of the image on the right-hand side that's missing.
Yeah, I don't know what's on there, but...
But on the left-hand side is undressed, and on the right-hand side is redressed. And they're kind of opposites, if you like. The left-hand side is about antiquity, and it's about rawness, and it's about things being stripped back, and it's about the body. It's in the same way that's about being naked. The materials in that space are a little bit like that as well. You know, what we're reflecting is kind of tones that are sandy and earthy, whereas if you were able to see that image on the right-hand side, you'd also see that the mannequins, we have mannequins instead of sculptures, but they also exist on plinths, and they're in dialogue with each other, but instead those plinths are made out of representation of glass, i.e. glass is made from sand, and there's a kind of really kind of complete dialogue there. There's one's about antiquity and one's about modernity. And it was really important just to provide a snapshot. You can see this space, which is quite rare, I think, in exhibitions, that you can see the end,
yes,
but you can't quite touch it.
You see where you've come from, where you are, and where you're going.
Yeah, and in this kind of really central pivot in the space. And so I think it's a clever use of space in that gallery as well, to bring people into the centre and then push them out to the sides. But it's really important to see that. And then there's a view behind you. I don't know if that's also
we have it.
in this. There's a view behind you where you get a snapshot into kind of the grand country house, and there's a moment where you go through the corridors of this space, and there's a juxtaposition that doesn't necessarily exist in the visual, but it exists in the audio and the sonic. Mm-hmm. That overlaid of your experience of this grand country house in a European setting is West African high life music.
Yeah, we always undercut it, don't we?
Yeah.
And I want to bring Marta in now. Marta, you have been research assistant on this project since
2 years.
2 years. 2 years. From your perspective, coming from Venice to work at the V&A, where you did, of course, do your masters, but do you have any sort of reflections on the experience of the last 2 years?
Yeah.
In your, I'm sure you do.
I do.
I bet you do. Just be really interesting to hear from your point of view how you saw the evolution of the project, and were there any surprises? What did you come away with? Do you still want to be a curator?
It was a very complex project because I was kind of brought in when the project was already formed, and I was actually supposed to stay for just above a year, but then because of the pandemic the show was postponed, so I had the chance to be much more involved in not only all the the logistical aspects related to research, but also I had the chance to contribute to the content as well. And I think that not only not only on the curatorial side, but also on the conversations that the curatorial group was having with all the other departments of the museum, and also with the other people that were brought into the project. And I think that we were talking about this space, this transitional space, but we haven't said the name of the space, which you call Pinnacle, right? Mm. And to me, the Pinnacle is very important. It was very important also in terms of learning how to deal with objects and with space, because the Pinnacle was, I think, a spatial solution, but also a response to a very important object that is a very transitional object that didn't really belong to any one of the three galleries, but needed time and pause and reflection and needed a space. Mm. And I think that you responded with a space to the object. The object is this videos of performance by trans artist Casilles. I think it's 16 hours long, but we have just a short cut. And what happens in the performance is that the artist stands in front of an ice torso, so a model of a torso made of ice, and these ice kind of drips down because it's heated by the heat of the trans body of the artist. So this body is kind of unmaking masculinity in a way, or unmaking the ideal that we were trying to set up, but also counteract in the first gallery. And this unmaking, it's so poetic, and it needs a completely different pace and a completely different mindset to understand it from the one that you need to kind of understand what's going on with all the colors in the dress, but also you need a more enclosed space than the one that you have in the first gallery, which is very airy and you're allowed to go around. There's no set route in the first gallery. So I think that what you did with the space was really responding to the selection of objects. And I think that really taught me something more about how you curate an exhibition and not just display things in a room.
Can I ask a question of Claire? Because I think it's really interesting to hear you speak of that. And what happens is this Casilles piece is a...
Sorry, it went off again.
I mean, you've seen it.
Yes.
But that piece sits at the centre of the exhibition, and it's a kind of touchstone. You catch glimpses. You can see other spaces, but you can see it from other spaces.
And you can hear it melting as well, can't you?
And you can hear it.
Exactly.
But that, to me, that's a very different position that's a very different object that sits as the kind of continuous thread throughout the exhibition than the one or the protagonist that you were first thinking of, which was Beau Brummel.
Yes. We booted him out, didn't we?
How was you doing? What was that transition like?
I think as the exhibition developed, it was always really important that this was a show about fashion and art, and my co-curator Rosalind is an art historian. What I find very beautiful about fashion is its elusiveness, its mischievous appropriating, it's the way it deteriorates and gets rebuilt, and to find artworks that speak to the magic of fashion, the fact that it's so connected to so many other disciplines, and you see it in the V&A. Fashion is everywhere, in the stained glass, in the effigies, in the sculpture, in the portraits. It just infiltrates everywhere, and it borrows, so it's pushing in and pulling back. What kind of art was there, apart from the obvious and the very beautifully obvious? The oil paintings depict the clothing in a hyperreal way that cannot be shown by the actual surviving garments. Perhaps even when they were originally made, would they have even looked as glossy and, perfect? But to find this key installation, which was about being clothed in ice, but the ice is taking the form of a torso, and it's melting, we find some echoes in fashion design. So, for example, in the work of J.W. Anderson, Antonin de Saint-Saëns, creating translucent suits. There's a real sense, to my mind, that fashion at the moment, particularly in menswear, is really exploring uncharted waters because it's taking on responsibility for challenging a singular sort of... Fashion is never singular, and it's always complex, and it's always multifaceted, but sometimes fashion is very much flat on, it's what you see on the catwalk. But these other explorations, think about Craig Green with the deconstructed shirts and suits, and then Castiles, who I imagine probably never thought they would find themselves the linchpin of a fashion exhibition, but were very happy to be there and to be treated with such respect by you. It's really beautiful, actually.
Yeah, and I think that, I see what you mean, because we kept talking about Brummel, and I remember the meetings with Jayden on Teams just talking about this. Champion of menswear, the first dandy, but then we couldn't find any object there, and there's nothing that resists.
Sorry.
And it feels like this figure itself was kind of melting in our hands because we couldn't find it anywhere. So I think that Castiles is not, there's no direct correspondence to this ghost that is around, is everywhere. But in a way, this idea of dripping and dissolution is connected to the fact that such an icon has no material translation in any object that we could find. So we had to evoke him in different ways, either more conceptual, talking about perfectionism, or more material, but looking at the objects from the 1950s for grooming that was so particular and so precise, that spoke to the idea of perfectionism and details, and the shift from the flamboyancy of the 18th century to a more demure but incredibly precise way of presenting yourself that kind of became the rule in the 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, there are no portraits of Brummel because he was too vain to be painted. He said that no portrait could ever reflect his beauty. And so he remains this ghost-like figure who is most easily accessed through writings about him. There are two biographies written of him, one not long after he died, and then Ian Kelly's written a really good book. But I spoke to Ian about it, and he said that he's the ultimate ghost. You're always chasing him. He is a little bit like fashion. But what I think is left behind of him is, metaphorically, the pile of discarded cravats that he threw onto the floor when he wasn't satisfied with the particular tie of the cravat. And actually, we had a bit of a cravat moment ourselves because I asked our conservators to make a cravat, based on the model that Beau Brummel used, which is Irish linen laundered in the country, so particular. We had the size and everything. And our poor conservator was also throwing them on the floor. She kept trying and trying and trying to tie the cravat, and then we didn't include it in the show in the end. So, he got shunted, actually, to a corner, which is a very beautiful corner of the show. And it's a corner where we focus on the abandonment, the renunciation of lace and velvet and silks. And we go via this little section on Anglomania where we look at country clothing. And here we are. And we have Omar Victor Diop parodying the Brumlesque perfection. He's placing himself into the sort of portrait that you see on the right. Here he is again. And Jayden, you had a completely brilliant touch in the third gallery where I said I want it all to be monochrome. And you said yes. And then you put orange panels in. Absolutely fantastic. It's so urban. It's so heated. And so, it just worked brilliantly. It would have been very gloomy without the orange, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and maybe that goes back to Claire's original point that she didn't really like our original submission, which is that our first presentation of this place was quite, it was like the opening scene of a James Bond movie, wasn't it? It said, we've got 50 suits. We want to display 50 monochrome suits or something similar.
Because we had 50 suits at that point.
And it ended up quite black and white. But there's a history to this kind of injection of colour, which is street style. There was a moment which was about uniforms. There was kind of depictions of kind of Black Panthers in the States, and it's really the only. I kind of want to come back to overdressed as well because there's a little bit that I'd love to talk about, but this section redressed is really the only section which has a chronology attached to it. In some ways, it's really about the past 120 years.
Yeah, it goes from about the 1840s with a frock coat to the present.
So in around the 150-year mark, and it's really about the 20th century as kind of its meat. And we were really thinking about a mid-century disruption. It's the biggest section. And we were thinking that what's happening in the middle of the 20th century, when youth culture and street style and protest. And originally that mid-century disruption was meant to be like blood red. And it's quite good that it's orange. It takes the edge off it, but it's kind of that glow of vitality and that energetic kind of pulse that shifts things in a certain direction. And the pace of production attached to some of the works changes after that point. Everything it's about. There's a change of production that comes after the mid 20th century point, which is about mass industrialization, contemporary living, jeans and fashion and mass fashion that exists after that point. And we really wanted to kind of try and signify that transition and that change. And there's another element which is in this section that the orange is complementary to the curtains. So remember we had the curtains in undressed and we have the curtains in redressed, and they're kind of siblings. But there's a very different narrative attached to them, whereas one is thinking about the body in undressed, one is definitely thinking about the planet in this kind of context of modernity. And whilst that depiction is very much about the setting in which this fashion took place, we've really gone from what we thought we were seeking to do is have this. What was the technical innovation that applied to? It's very much about the metropolis, and what was the technical innovation that exists in the metropolis that signifies its development? And we thought that was really bound up in glass. If you remember the kind of early Victorian era arcades, we'd have huge expanses of glass but very small panes, and then you go through this Mies van der Rohe moment where you get huge curtain walls, and actually it's glazing that signifies the kind of the emerging cities, super cities, mega cities, and the panes of glass, the panels change size through that moment, and they have little hints of orange in them, which is that we were pulling these colours. We worked with really amazing graphic designers called Studio Hugo Blanzat, and they'd done all of the graphic design, and they didn't quite sign up to doing these kind of 400 square meters worth of curtains, but they did, and they took that on. And that orange comes from analysing videos and how kind of glass is blown and like picking different hues out of that. And it's just a kind of a nod to the energy intensiveness of mass production and the 20th century and the time that follows.
And I do remember in the third gallery, I said, can we have machines? Can we have trains rumbling underground? And we tried it. It was a disaster, wasn't it? Because it was actually a bit like the South Cone Tube rumbling underground the V&A, which it does anyway. So we got rid of that, and we just left it with sounds which did allude to the mechanisation of production and the uniformity of beginning with a frock coat. And just to dwell for a moment on the frock coat, when we started looking in our collection, I sort of dimly remembered, because I had started going through the menswear collection, which of course is, huge. I mean, everything in the V&A is in copious quantities. And then it was interrupted by the pandemic, and I think I've got up to 1830 or something. And I thought there would be lots more frock coats in our collection. As it turns out, we've only got a handful. And I kept thinking, but this is crazy, because they're ubiquitous. They're in the Degas painting that we include of the bankers at the stock exchange. They were worn by every man of every class throughout the whole 19th century. What's happened to them all? And I became so transfixed by their absence that I actually wrote an essay on, where have all the frock coats gone, for a Swedish publication. They were also going to do an exhibition, but it was cancelled because of the pandemic. So this sort of search for the missing menswear became a preoccupation, a little bit like Brummel disappearing. You're reaching for him, he's going. And I was thinking, where have all the frock coats gone? But actually, we realised that you could imply multitudes through just having 5 or 6, couldn't you? Mm. And you did that with that long, long case.
Mm. And I think what's really important, it's the long case, and it's also being able to see them in the round in terms of kind of mirrors as well. Mm-hmm. It was a really big part of our discussions. I remember there was one moment where we came in and you were aghast at you. There was you seemed sad in this meeting. I said, what's up with Claire?
I'm often sad.
What's wrong? And then it finally transpired that you was upset that you couldn't see the back of the garments
that's right.
in a certain way, and that you really wanted to see some of the garments in the round. And
yeah.
I think that's a really lovely moment, because when you walk along that really long case, there are more. There's
more. We've created more through illusion. Mm. And talking of illusion, Marta, I want to go back to you. You've worked with Judith, of course, and your PhD, which you've just completed, is in Italian menswear. And you have a great sense, in terms of the suit, of mass production. Mm-mm. Do you think that the third gallery conveyed that? I mean, were you sad?
Well, yes, a little bit. It was, but
Apart
I think
Romeo and Gigli.
Yeah, Romeo and Gigli, which is kind of linked to mass production, because that's the shift from bespoke tailoring to, and it's more than a shift, it's a translation of the quality of bespoke tailoring into something that can be mass produced. And I think that we tried so hard to have something that could signal that shift, or that could represent mass production. But I think that having studied and researched menswear, and especially ready-to-wear menswear, for so long, made me understand that absence is really what you kind of base your research on. And as you were surprised that there were no more than a handful of frock coats in the collection, when I started researching menswear, I was surprised that the V&A hadn't done a show on menswear, nor did many other museums. It was a subject that was so interesting for me and full of nuances, but still no objects were there. And I don't think we have a lot of ready-made clothes, but at the same time, I think that what we tried to do was to represent the democratization of the suit. which is the conceptualization of ready-to-wear. And we did that reflecting on streetwear and street styles and street culture. So looking at what the teddy boys were doing at the end of the 1940s, just appropriating of the Edwardian suit, but then turning it into something completely different that was worn in the street by working class boys that were appropriating of a style, but then changing it completely. So I think that was a very synthetic solution that had to do with space, with the fact that it was the end of a long exhibition. It's a long journey, the exhibition. Doing a full tour takes 1 hour and a half. And as you can stay, like sitting down for 2 hours and a half, listening to a lecture, probably at some point your attention level just drops. So I think that after many thoughts and many changes in our object list, we decided to go for this very synthetic but very meaningful 3 objects. And we basically have one Edwardian suit, a teddy boy interpretation by Hardy Amis, but in the center of this kind of triptych. And we worked a lot with kind of 3 objects in many spaces.
You're right, yes.
Yeah, we have a Michelangelo Pistoletto work that's a sort of mirror. I don't think we have an image of that, but it's a mirror with a figure of a man wearing a suit, standing.
Here we go. Here's the Pierre Cardin on the left, and then
and then we move
Eddie
it
Slimane.
Basically after the Leather Boys.
Yes,
group.
Margiela.
And this mirror again, which is not a design feature, but it's one of the objects, but refers back to the design of the space and the elements of the design. It's a really good way of making the audience get into the display and imagine and multiply their image and feel like they're part of this group that is the mass that wears suit after the Second World War.
There's so many bookends to this. Every time I speak about the exhibition, I think, that's a lovely bookend. You know, these are good. These are really lovely pairing. But at the beginning of the exhibition, we said, this idea it's about the body. So what we really wanted to, in terms of the visitor journey, was to encourage people to feel like they were also part of the show, and there is a really overt moment where that happens at the very, very end. But there are nods to it, hints to it at the beginning in terms of the abstraction of what's the very first suit, the Cray Green, the abstraction of the very first Cray Green suit in which there is no body. It just gives you just enough space to imagine yourself in that moment.
And this is what you're talking about, the mirrored finale, where everybody in the exhibition becomes part of the dancing, the leaping, the posing, and the plinth is lowered, so you could almost step onto it.
Yeah.
You could almost become part of that.
And we always said we wanted this thing to be a journey from piazza to pizzazz. It was a line we included in the beginning of the brief, and you start with the South Ken Piazza and the square, and you end up in this kind of pizzazz moment at the end. Yes. I think you really get that.
I think so. I mean, I think the sort of multi-layering, I think it got stronger because we had more time to work. We had this sort of strange borrowed year where, well, first of all, we were furloughed, and then we thought the show, we didn't know what was happening, and then it got postponed, and we had this strange extra year in the middle where we really explored the layers of not only the history of menswear and fashion exhibitions and displays in the V&A and beyond, but we also explored the sort of strange time travelling that can happen in a show, and you really helped with that. And then you brought the sort of armature. You were the Craig Green in some ways. You hung the ideas on the armature in a way that he hung the pieces of this broken up suit on the armature as well. And I think that I don't think I've ever been involved in a show that's been so, I've never been more unsure of a show, I'll be honest. Not the subject, not the structure, not the colleagues.
Maybe the design.
Not the design, no. All of this was good. I just thought, can we keep it together? Can we keep all this layering together, all these connections? But what was really lovely was when we were walking through the show after we'd finished the installation, I started noticing connections that we hadn't planted. They just appeared. Like, for example, between the Alexander McQueen suit with the cloak with the white lining, I suddenly realised that the Maharaja of Indore was also wearing an identical cloak. And that's a painting from the 1920s, and it's a McQueen suit from 2009. That wasn't planned. I don't know how it happened.
But I think it's also connected to the fact that the process of curation was very different because it was online. For most part of the last bit was done in a very kind of different way, I guess, from what you were used to, working directly with objects. Well,
Absolutely.
Here we were working with images and endless conversations on Teams where we were moving like small images on a PowerPoint, trying to see if they could fit together. And I think that the module, the 3 objects to say 3 objects could convey a message, was maybe one of the most successful ways in which we kind of managed to, exactly.
I mean, when I'm teaching here and elsewhere, I always say, you know, the solution is in the object. If you don't know, go to the archive, go and look at the object. It will speak to you. It'll tell you. We couldn't do that. So you know those little games where you keep shuffling around squares in order to, you know, my partner would leave for work in the morning to the sound of the 3 of us talking, and sometimes you as well. We'll come back sort of 8 or 9 hours later. We're still online, still saying, well, if we put the goatee next to the Spanx, and, you know, and all this. And it was forever this finessing and adjusting that I've never had the privilege of such time before, but also you know, to be able to acknowledge to everybody the frailties of fashion exhibitions and the frailties of the objects and the frailties of ourselves, thinking, are we mad, or, you know, is this going to be good? Is this going to change the landscape of discussion about exhibitions?
I wanted to add one kind of piece of advice to yours. If that's the case, your advice is go and seek out the objects and it will give you the answer. But what I really learned from this as a process is there's such power in illustrating your ideas. Like, never be afraid to illustrate them and continuously to illustrate them. Because I remember there was a moment where I was with the rest of the team and I said, well, we had mannequins and we had little labels for what work would be where. And I said to it, guys, we have to draw all of these objects. So we drew all of the garments, we drew all of the mannequins. You got that kind of mannequin with the ginormous shoes, and all of a sudden I felt like there was a change of pace at that moment, and it would allow people the confidence to make decisions and to make those connections.
Well, I think that's a lovely moment to end on, about drawing mannequins and big shoes and having confidence and just keeping going, whatever the world throws at you. And so I have no idea what the time is, but
it is, you're a genius time-wise, because it is in fact 6:30. And so I know some people need to go. Jayden, I think, needs to go very shortly. So I wonder whether you would stay for a few moments just for 1 or 2 questions. And then I think it can become less formal. And as I say, Claire and Marta kindly said they would stay put for a few extra moments if people had sort of personal questions for them or wanted to come and approach them with questions. But I find myself with the mic, so I think I am the roaming mic. So if anyone has a question, please do. Okay, let's see how it goes. Otherwise, I'll bring it to you. I can hear you, but...
So was there anything about the theme, because I know menswear is a huge zone to venture into. So was there anything about the sort of framework that undressed and overdressed and redressed gave you to sort of delve into how men interact? Thank you. How men interact with their clothing and fashion, and were there any other frameworks that you were considering to kind of give some structure to this whole thing, to the whole exhibition?
I mean, we were aware that we were 3 women curating an exhibition about menswear, And we were very mindful of, whose gaze is this? Who's looking? Who's being looked at? We talked to a lot of people about the show, probably complete strangers on the bus, actually. But we ran a series of workshops, 3 one-day workshops, 1 for each section, where we talked to those who had researched menswear their entire lives, those who were collectors. Think about Charlie Porter, for example, who has donated a lot of his personal collection and is a journalist, brilliant writer. We talked to Sarah Goldsmith, who's done a lot of work on the torso. I mean, there's so many people that we consulted.
Yeah, Charlie's interesting because Charlie is also a wearer.
Yeah.
So the kind of stories that he would tell you were about in which club he was wearing that Raf Simons bomber jacket. And that gave, I think, a lot of nuances to what we selected, and also how we kind of wrote the labels afterwards. Because I think that a big work is writing the interpretation of the exhibition, and that was quite hard, challenging, but because we wanted not just to include the curatorial voice, but also the voice of the designers, but also the wearers. So for us, it was about, where's the agency? It was about the gaze, but it was also about the agency.
Exactly.
And the agency is not just in who creates, I say it like this because it's who designs, who produces, but also who wears. And in this way, actually, I think that we open up to clothes that were worn by women, for instance. I think that Marlene Dietrich, in this sense, is very important in the redressed section because she...
That's Charlie there, by the way.
Yeah, Charlie. And
in his socks.
I took this photo because I went there to pick up that... to actually convince him to give us, to donate because he wasn't kind of ready to part from it yet. So this emotional attachment to the clothes was very important, and I think that we tried as much as we could to include this in the display, but maybe more, it was easier just to articulate it with words in the interpretation.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask about how did you approach, or if you somehow incorporated gender identity in your exhibition, and how did you go around it?
Yeah, it was really important to us, and certainly we thought about it a lot in terms of the mannequins. The mannequin was designed in terms of the colour of the surface. Each mannequin was tailor-made for the garment. We don't alter the garments, we alter the mannequins. In some cases, we could use mannequins that were sort of, shop window display, but others we created from scratch. And certainly, it's been very, very, moving to receive quite a few communications from the trans community to say that they never imagined that they would be represented in an exhibition in this way. So we have one particular figure that's custom made based on the outfit that we show, and then in other cases we represented as wide and diverse a community as we possibly could. We also, for example, we used female mannequins in some of the menswear. If it was particularly early, the figures would be the clothing is much smaller. So we tried to sort of, in a gentle way, challenge museological practice of how clothing would be put onto the mannequins. We thought as much about the mannequins as we did think about the body in the first gallery. I don't know if you want to...
Yeah, and at the same time, we didn't want to be tokenistic or to kind of pigeonhole the gender identity question in one section. So it's much more, it's holistic the way we treated it. So we have examples throughout the exhibitions that can be found if you follow the route and if you really get into the different folds of the exhibition.
Anyone else? It's just for the recording.
I wanted to ask about how partnership with a brand affects curatorial practice, if at all, and also if you could elaborate a bit about the choice of music in each section, because I think that was mentioned. I thought that was really interesting.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear.
Music. The brand and music.
Sorry, it was two questions in one.
Okay. Should we start with the brand?
Yeah.
So the exhibition is sponsored by Gucci, and Alessandro Michele, who took over Gucci in 2015, has adamantly stated from the very first his passionate belief in challenging stereotypes. And so it was a very good starting point for a sponsor. In terms of the relationship, the sponsor has no curatorial agency. It's entirely independent from our side. Otherwise, we simply wouldn't do it. It helps nobody. So we presented at the beginning. They loved the idea, loved the concept. They did not say how much Gucci is going to be in this show. Again, that was entirely our choice. I think there's 3 looks, isn't there?
Yeah.
And so it's something that we're well practiced at the museum. But I think on this occasion there probably could not be a better fit, because at the beginning of the show we included his statement from...
Yeah, it's from the collection of 2019, which tackled directly toxic masculinity. It was the Rave collection. Welcome to My Rave, I think was the title or something like that. But he decided that as sponsor statement, he gave us a part of the press release of the collection, which was written before and was written with no connection to the show whatsoever, because the show wasn't there at the moment. But it spoke so well to all the things that we were doing and trying to speak about in the exhibition, that it felt the perfect fit for the show. And actually the sponsor usually comes in quite late in the day. So the object list was pretty much set when they came on board as sponsor of the exhibition. I don't know, Jayden, if you want to tackle the music.
Yeah. I think the music is a really big part of the exhibition. I'm really glad you mentioned it. For everyone's benefit, you've kind of got these abstract, stripped back, earthy sounds in the first section. You've got this West African highlife music in the second, and then you have the digital iteration of those kind of stripped back earthy sounds in the third section. In the finale, you've got a booming soundtrack, and that's really kind of to dance out to. But I think there's another element to the music. One is that we wanted it to be theatrical as an experience, and we really foregrounded that stuff at the beginning. But also we had some really great conversations about, I would say, about voice and about expression. And a derivative of that is the sonic element to it. And actually there is still voice. We found that voice was actually a little bit distracting in how people project poetry. We had discussions about people projecting poetry into the space at some point. It was a really fabulous conversation. Sometimes we turned up intending to speak about something and didn't even ever get round to it. But actually there is voice, and you do get that in the West African highlife kind of overlay. And I think it's really important for AVA. We already saw that whilst we had the objects and whilst we had the exhibition design, there was a moment towards the end where the musical overlay came in. I think we all had ideas as they were permeating throughout to say, okay, what's missing here? What does it really need to be complete in that essence? If I had it my way, we would have done it at the beginning, I think, throughout. Something that I'm actually trying to push kind of V&As to do as well, because I just think it being considered a material palette, in some ways it's so much like fabric, like it's ephemeral, it's dynamic, it's moving. It would be a really nice thing to grapple with, and I haven't yet seen I've seen very few shows that do that very, very well. So I think we're kind of edging towards that, and I think it really gives a kind of an edge to the spaces. I might have to shoot.
I was just going to say I'm going to bring it to a close with with, as I say, a bracketed promise that those who want to linger can, of course, do so. But I just wanted to thank you while you're still sitting here, all three of you, for such a wonderful insight. I mean, as I said, it's so central to what we do at the Centre for Fashion Curation, and the opportunity to have all three of you kind of remembering conversations whilst the exhibition is still on is a luxury that is just extraordinary for I'm sure all of us here. So thank you so much for giving us the 3D.
Symposium.
You want to...
Thank you.
Claire has a postscript I'm going to hand over.
Postscript, yes. We are running a 2-day symposium on the 13th and 14th of October, and Marta is convening it and organising us all. If you can come, please do. We have the most wonderful speakers.
Yes, we have 19 speakers, and we're going beyond the scope of the exhibition. We try to select. We had an incredible turnaround of papers, of abstracts that came back after we launched the call for paper. We have 19 amazing speakers, different. The subject is still masculinity and fashion, but we're trying to see where the scholarship is going. So you're very welcome to check out the V&A website where the program is available and get the ticket if you're interested in coming.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.